So, a few days after this video's posting, Avengers Endgame will hit theaters. I have no idea if I'll be able to see it in time to make a review for opening weekend. Not that I think it'll matter, I'm guessing everyone in the world is going to see it anyway. But all the same, I thought now would be a good time to revisit Avengers Infinity War. Because if you were around on this channel when I first saw that movie, I was one of the few people out there who didn't have much in the way of positive words for it. Which proved to be semi-controversial. Not like it was a big deal, certainly, but I certainly did have a lot of people wondering, what the heck? I mean, how on earth could you not like Infinity War, and yet at the same time you like movies like Rampage and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom? How on earth do you explain why Infinity War of all movies is the one that you didn't give a good grade to? Well, trust me folks, I was as surprised that I didn't like it as you were to hear that I didn't like it. Having seen it a couple more times since then, I will say that my feelings towards it have softened now that the initial shock has certainly worn off. I don't know how much the shock actually played into it or not, but I am not as hard on it now as I was back when I first saw it. That doesn't mean I think it's really the pinnacle of what the MCU can do, or that I think it's the best Avengers movie. I still think that it is heavily, heavily flawed, and those flaws need to be discussed, because otherwise, how will people know what to fix as they move forward and try to make their own Infinity War? First of all, there's the portrayal of Thanos. Now, don't get the wrong idea. I'm not opposed to the idea of Thanos being a more sympathetic character who isn't necessarily mustache-twirlingly evil. The idea of having a complex villain who may not even think he is a villain is a good idea, and the portrayal of Thanos in the film is very well done. I will say that. It is a great portrayal of a great villain, and if there's one thing the MCU has always struggled with, it's having great villains. Most of them are forgettable because because the heroes are so interesting, but also partly because the villains mostly just serve as an obstacle to the heroes. The story is about the heroes going on their own journey most of the time, and the villains are just sort of another thing for them to overcome. So having Thanos be a more complex character than just another roadblock on the journey, good move. But I still don't think it really lines up with the visions we've had of Thanos prior to that point. Admittedly, we haven't seen much of Thanos prior to that point, I admit that. He's been more of a presence, only showing up on occasion to remind us that he's there and he's working on something earth-shattering, universe-shattering, in fact. But at the same time, all of those previous examples seem to line up with how he was portrayed in the comics, which is to say, pure evil. Like, unsympathetic, uncaring, just plain bad. The ultimate bad, but still just bad, without much complexity to it. And thus, a large part of what Infinity War had to do was basically reintroduce Thanos. I guess it was a simultaneous introduction-reintroduction, because like I said, we hadn't really gotten to know him prior to that point, but we still had seen enough of him to get a sense of who he was. And this was basically coming along, Infinity War came along and said, everything you know is wrong about Thanos. Or at least skewed slightly. And that wound up kind of throwing me a little, I admit, because the common perception people have of the MCU is that they have a plan. They know where they're going. that only holds up if you stand back and look at things in a very generalized sense. Once you actually start scrutinizing the MCU, you realize that, sure, they have a general idea of where they want to go, but just as often, if not more so, they're making things up on the fly. I mean, look at Phase 1. The Incredible Hulk was supposed to lead the charge with that. That was their plan. But the Incredible Hulk movie with Edward Norton wound up underperforming and has since kind of become the redheaded stepchild of the MCU. Nobody wants to talk about it. You can basically skip it. I've said in past videos, it is the one MCU movie you do not need to see. Instead, Iron Man wound up taking the world by storm, which led to Iron Man 2 being greenlit when there wasn't originally a plan or anything really set in stone for Iron Man 2. And, well, the rest is history. So, that's just one example I can name that Marvel doesn't really have as solid of a plan as a lot of fans like to believe. Not that they have no plan at all, but it's a plan in a constant state of flux. And I do believe Thanos is another sign of that. He is a character who is clearly being planned to go in one direction, but then it veered off in another. So, how could we fix that? The only solution I can come up with myself would have been to do a Thanos-centered movie first. Have something that tells Thanos' story from the beginning. We see all of the events of the MCU that he's shown up in through his eyes, get his perspective on things. That sets up that what we thought we knew about Thanos may not be entirely the case. Not that he's really a good guy, but he's certainly not doing this for the diabolical reasons everyone perceives. He's not the total monster that we may have been led to believe, even if he does ultimately still wind up doing what he does. Now, granted, that does mean Marvel wouldn't really get rights to say they did the first supervillain-centric comic book movie. That honor would still go to DC with Suicide Squad. But you can bet it would have been better received than Suicide Squad. But starting with a Thanos-centric movie would have actually done more than just reintroduce the character to audiences. It also would have freed up more space in Infinity War for the characters to really shine. Because a large part of Infinity War is devoted to reintroducing Thanos and showing us this new take on the character which had not been previously established. Since a good chunk of that has to happen in the movie, and, I mean, the movie is long, but it's not that long, that means that all of the other characters kind of fall to the wayside. It's like a Marvel movie in reverse. I said earlier, one of the big problems with the MCU thus far has been that, for the most part, the villains have been forgettable. They always feel kind of secondary to all the stuff going on with the heroes. You have your exceptions, of course. Loki, Ultron, Ego. I'm sure there are others. But for the most part, they're just sort of there to be obstacles. And it feels like the inverse happened with Infinity War. Thanos was really the central character of that. You could even say he was the protagonist, not the hero, but the protagonist. There is a difference. But as a result, all of the heroes, all of the Avengers characters and the Guardians and whatnot, they wound up falling to the wayside. There was so many of them packed into one space. Even though they were broken off into little groups, you didn't really feel like, or at least I didn't feel like, they all had a chance to really shine as characters. With the Guardians in particular, Drax, you watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volumes 1 and 2, Drax, even though he's kind of a goofball because he's a very literally minded character and he's very blunt when he speaks, he's also got a lot of heart to him. He's got that underlying sadness. That scene in Volume 2 where he's talking to Mantis and the subject of his family comes up. And even though he's remaining completely stoic, when Mantis touches him and she starts bawling her eyes out as she feels his emotions, that says a lot. You would never get that impression of Drax if you started with Infinity War. You would just think he's a silly character. I mean, that's just one example. You can also say that, like, the interactions between Tony Stark and Stephen Strange, not necessarily that memorable. Certainly not as memorable as seeing Tony Stark interact with Steve Rogers. Because, in that case, the MCU versions of Stark and Strange are just too similar to each other in terms of personality. The first Doctor Strange movie, I like it. It's basically Iron Man 1 with magic instead of technology. And Stephen Strange is very similar to Tony Stark in that movie. So, putting these two on screen together, yes, there's a bit of friction involved, but it's not the same kind of friction that really resonates. When you put Stark and Rogers on screen together and have them with a conflict of some sort, like in the Avengers movies or in Captain America Civil War, they are drastically different characters. Very different worlds, very different upbringings. So, in that sense, watching them bounce off each other is more entertaining. Now, had we gotten a bit more time to develop Doctor Strange, maybe that would have been different. Or, if there was just more room for them to have interactions in Infinity War, it might have been different. Who knows? But if we don't need to reintroduce Thanos, then we have more room for the characters to really bounce off each other and have a good sense of interaction between everyone across the board. Granted, I can't prove that that would have been the case, but ultimately we'll never know now. But again, I do feel like my perception towards Infinity War has softened somewhat. I can appreciate that they actually managed to pull off bringing all of these characters together. So that alone deserves kudos. And it was kind of cool, even if it wasn't necessarily as interesting as the first time, to see all of these characters together. But at the same time, there's something about Infinity War that does really bother me that I feel is a bigger flaw than everything else. I swear, I'm not saying this to be contrarian, I genuinely do think this is an issue. It's the ending, not the fact that Thanos wins. I mean, that is shocking, yes. That was not something anybody expected. But it's the way in which they pulled it off that I think is ultimately the downfall of Infinity War. Like I said, the first time you see it, it's shocking. Nobody saw this coming. You think the heroes are going to win. It's their toughest struggle so far, but still, somehow you're expecting them to pull it off, even if so many of them have fallen at this point, and then everything changes with the snap of a finger. You're seeing all of these heroes disappear into dust. There goes Black Panther, and there goes Spider-Man, and there goes all but one Guardian of the Galaxy. They are all turned to dust and gone forever. And by forever, I mean until their sequels come out, which in the case of Spider-Man is a couple of months after Endgame. So, that kind of softens the blow a little. They're coming back. We know for a fact they're coming back, and whatever happens in the next movie is going to undo what Thanos has done. It doesn't really feel like the sort of ending that's gonna hold up. It's shocking now, but when you're 10 years from now and you know that there are like 4 or 5 other movies with all of these characters in them, well, Infinity War just kind of feels like a brief hiccup. It's actually kind of interesting how much fan perceptions have changed in that regard, because I remember back when the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV series was first announced and greenlit and we got the trailers, And we saw that Phil Coulson was in it. And Coulson, of course, had died in the first Avengers. His death was, in fact, the motivating thing that brought the heroes together. So you had all these people saying, no, they can't bring Coulson back because that cheapens death in the MCU, and we don't want that to happen. Death is already cheap enough in the comics where characters are constantly dying and then getting better from it. To do that in the movies means death will no longer have any meaning. And of all the different facets of the MCU, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. never really did have the best reputation. It had its fans, certainly. I enjoyed it. It had its high peaks and low valleys, certainly. But it never quite bounced back from that initial impression of it not being good and somehow cheapening the MCU. Now, Infinity War comes along and sets things up to have the exact same path as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where characters who were killed are going to come back, and people are calling it the greatest superhero movie ever made. My, how the times have changed. Like I said, it's not the fact that Thanos is victorious that bothers me about this ending. It's the fact that he killed all of the characters that we know are coming back. Having thought about it, there are only two ways that come to mind that I think could have genuinely fixed this issue. The first one would have been have the old guard of heroes fall. All of those characters who were there in Phase 1, all of the people who have been established for a long time, have them be the ones that Thanos snaps into dust. Because they don't have sequels greenlit. None of them do. In fact, a lot of them have been saying they're kinda ready to stop now. Not that I blame them. They've certainly earned a respite. But at the same time, if you get rid of them, that actually raises the stakes, because these are the established heroes. These are the ones who are the real champions. And if they fall, if they not only fail to beat the villain, but they also are killed in the process for all intents and purposes, then when you bring about Endgame, you're left with the newcomers, the people who haven't been doing this for as long, who don't necessarily have the experience that the Avengers do, and thus they may not be entirely sure they can win. That creates some real tension. If Earth's mightiest heroes have fallen, how are the people who are going to step up and take their place manage to succeed? How are they gonna win? That makes for a far more intense idea, if you ask me. And if they manage to succeed and bring back the original heroes, even if those original heroes wind up retiring anyway, that makes the ending just that much better. It's like, yes, this really is good victory, and we're seeing these new heroes step up and prove that they can carry the MCU forward without these older characters. If Endgame winds up doing well, of course. We don't know at this point. The other thing that might have made the ending work would have been for Marvel to do the one thing it does not want to do. Have Infinity War and Endgame actually be the end. Like, the end of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the final story. Which we know it's not, because there are all sorts of sequels coming after it, like I said. But if they were really going to commit to this idea, then they may as well have had Endgame be the finale. Then they could have kept those same characters being dusted, but because of the fact that we know the next movie would be the last movie, that means anything goes. We don't know if those characters will be brought back. We don't know which heroes are going to live and which heroes are going to die. We just know that the end is here and anything can happen, because that's what happens in a truly great finale. But of course, Marvel's not going to do that. They are going to keep the MCU going for as long as possible. Again, not that I blame them. The MCU is pretty much a cultural icon at this point, And they're gonna keep it going for as long as they can. And as long as they can will probably be until the movies stop making money, which they have yet to do. But that does raise another issue, though. Endgame really does feel like it is gearing up to be the end. It really does feel like an ending. But if it's not, how on earth are they gonna top it? Because they've got a whole bunch of other characters coming along, and they've got to introduce new threats that would justify bringing all of those heroes together. But when you've got a villain who is already so powerful that he wiped out half of all life in the universe with just a snap of his fingers, who is a bigger threat than that? I don't know, folks. Endgame may very well be good. I am more than open to that idea. The trailers do look like they are gearing up for a truly epic showdown. But Infinity War, I don't think is going to age well. I think Infinity War will ultimately be viewed as kind of a way station of sorts. Shocking for the time, yes. In the moment, it was really surprising. But later on, when you know there's more to the story, I don't know. Only time will tell, I guess. Then again, what's done is done. Once the print is locked, it's set in stone. All I can do is take the lessons I learned from doing this sort of thing and apply them to my own original work. And try not to fall into the same potholes and flaws that I see other works fall into. That's really all I can do at this point. I do hope Avengers Endgame turns out to be the epic everyone is hoping it will be. I really do. As for Infinity War, like I said, I'm not as hard on it as I was, but I still don't think it's the masterpiece everyone was saying. That's just me, though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.